There is a question that has haunted Hollywood for over 5 decades. A question whispered in green rooms, debated in gossip columns, asked by fans in every country on Earth, and one that the man at the center of it all has never, until now, truly answered. That man is John Travolta. And the question isn't about any single scandal or any single secret. The question is this: who is John Travolta, really? Not the man you've seen dancing under disco lights. Not the man who famously twisted with Uma Thurman on a restaurant floor. Not the man in the white suit who made an entire generation fall in love with him through a single, perfectly swung hip. Who is the man that lives behind those eyes? Because if you look closely, really closely, you start to feel like the world never quite knew. And at 70 years old, with nothing left to prove and everything left to say, John Travolta is finally ready to tell us. So stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not the story Hollywood told you. It's the story Hollywood tried to hide. Let's start at the very beginning. February 18th, 1954. Englewood, New Jersey. A small blue-collar town that was not made for producing legends. The Travolta household was loud, loving, and chaotic in all the best ways. John's father, Salvatore Travolta, was a tire salesman of Italian descent who worked hard with his hands and built his life from scratch. His mother, Helen Burke, was an actress and singer of Irish descent who performed in a small local semi-professional group called the Sunshine Sisters. And if you're wondering where John Travolta got his fire, his expressiveness, his absolute magnetic desire to perform, look no further than Helen. She was the one who planted the seed. She was the one who sat little John down in front of the television, who took him to see live performances, who looked into her youngest child's eyes and saw something that most parents would have tried to talk out of a kid: the terrifying, consuming hunger to be on stage. John was the youngest of 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys, and from the very beginning, he was different. Not in a troubling way, but in the way that certain people are born already oriented towards something specific, as if the universe has already written their assignment, and it's just a matter of time before they figure it out. He was restless in school. Not because he was dumb, he was far from it, but because the classroom couldn't contain the energy that was already building inside him. While other kids were memorizing multiplication tables, John was studying the way people moved, the way faces changed when emotions hit them, the way a room could shift completely based on how one person chose to walk into it. He was watching. He was absorbing. He was preparing, even if he didn't know it yet. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already taking dance lessons. By 13, he was performing in local theater productions. By 16, he made the kind of decision that would have terrified most parents and excited only the bravest of mothers. He dropped out of high school. Completely. No diploma, no backup plan, no safety net. Just a one-way ticket to his dream. His parents, remarkable in their courage, gave him their blessing. His mother especially believed in him with a ferocity that bordered on prophecy. He packed up his life and headed to New York City and then to Los Angeles and began auditioning with the same relentless determination that would define every major chapter of his life. He got rejected more times than he could count. He took every small part he could find. He did commercials. He did summer theater. He did anything that kept him in the game and in the room where decisions were being made. And slowly, painfully slowly, the game began to notice him back. His first real foothold came in the form of a touring production of Grease. Yes, the same iconic story that would later make him a household name worldwide. At that point, Grease was still a small theatrical piece, not yet the cultural phenomenon it would become. But John threw himself into it completely. Then came a small but unforgettable role in the horror film Carrie in 1976, directed by Brian De Palma. It was the kind of role that doesn't make careers, but it makes people in the industry sit up and think, who is this kid? There is something about him. And then came the television show that first introduced John Travolta to living rooms across America. Welcome back, Kotter. He played Vinnie Barbarino, a lovably cocky Brooklyn high school student, and the role suited him like it was sewn onto his bones. Fan mail started arriving. Girls screamed when they saw him in public. The name John Travolta started showing up in conversations at record labels, at film studios, at talent agencies. The machine was beginning to recognize one of its own. But none of that, not Carrie, not Welcome Back, Cotter, not any of it, could have prepared the world for what was about to happen in 1977. Because in 1977, John Travolta made Saturday Night Fever. And everything changed. Everything. The film told the story of Tony Manero, a 19-year-old paint store clerk from Brooklyn who was suffocated by the smallness of his daily life, but came alive every weekend on the dance floor of a local disco club. It was raw, it was honest, it was sometimes brutal. The film had an R rating for a reason, and at its center was a performance so electric, so completely alive, that audiences simply could not look away. John Travolta didn't just play Tony Manero. He became him. He spent 9 months learning dance choreography with the film's choreographer Lester Wilson. He studied the way Brooklyn boys carried themselves, talked, fought, loved, and failed. He went into that performance with everything he had, and the result was something that transcended cinema. Saturday Night Fever became a cultural earthquake. The soundtrack sold over 40 million copies worldwide. Disco became the defining sound of an era. And John Travolta, 23 years old, from New Jersey, with no high school diploma, became one of the most famous human beings on the planet. But here is where the first shadow falls. And it's important because this shadow is the one most people have never properly understood. During the filming of Saturday Night Fever, John Travolta was in love. Genuinely, deeply, heartbreakingly in love. Her name was Diana Hyland, an accomplished actress, 15 years a senior, and a woman whose grace, intelligence, and tenderness apparently unlocked something in him that no one else ever had before. They had met on the set of a television film called The Boy in the Plastic Bubble in 1976, and what started as a working relationship became one of the most private and profound romances of his young life. He didn't talk about it much publicly. He didn't perform it for cameras. He simply loved her. And she loved him. And by 1977, as his star was beginning to permanently alter the atmosphere of Hollywood, Diana Hyland was diagnosed with breast cancer. She died on March 27, 1977, in John Travolta's arms. He was 23 years old. She was 41. And in the same season that the world was watching him dance with impossible joy and freedom across a Brooklyn disco floor, he was privately shattered. He attended the Academy Awards shortly after her death, nominated for Best Actor for Saturday Night Fever, and he sat there in that audience, surrounded by Hollywood's glittering elite, carrying a grief that most 23-year-olds could not even imagine surviving.
He did not win the Oscar that night.
But what he carried out of that auditorium was heavier than any golden statue. He carried the knowledge that fame is not shelter, that the louder the applause gets, the quieter the real pain becomes, and that sometimes the most visible people in the world are the loneliest ones in any given room. This was a lesson John Travolta learned young. And it was a lesson he would be forced to learn again, and again, and again throughout his life. But in 1978, the world didn't know any of this. The world only knew one thing, that John Travolta was unstoppable. Grease came out in the summer of 1978, and if Saturday Night Fever was an earthquake, Grease was the aftershock that lasted a generation. The film, a musical romantic comedy set in 1950s high school, gave John the chance to play the effortlessly cool Danny Zuko opposite the luminous Olivia Newton-John, and the result was pure cinematic joy. Summer Nights, Greased Lightnin', You're the One That I Want. These weren't just songs, they were cultural touchstones that would be sung at school productions and karaoke bars and wedding receptions for the next 50 years. Grease became one of the highest-grossing musical films in history, and John Travolta became one of the very rare performers who had delivered back-to-back career-defining performances before the age of 25. He was, by every conceivable measure, at the absolute peak of the mountaintop. And then, as happens to people who climb too high too fast without the right foundation, he began to fall. The early 1980s should have been the years when John Travolta consolidated his empire. Instead, they became the years that taught him the cruelest truth Hollywood has to offer, that the industry that builds you up is the same industry that will dismantle you with equal enthusiasm. Moment by Moment in 1978 was his first misstep, a romantic drama opposite Lily Tomlin that critics and audiences alike dismissed almost immediately. Urban Cowboy in 1980 had its admirers and performed adequately, but the lightning of Saturday Night Fever and Grease was not recaptured. Blowout in 1981 earned him critical praise, but was a commercial disappointment. Then came Staying Alive in 1983, a sequel to Saturday Night Fever directed by Sylvester Stallone, which was widely considered an artistic disaster. And then came Perfect in 1985, a film so poorly received that it effectively ended the first chapter of John Travolta's career. The scripts dried up. The phone calls slowed down. The studios that had once lined up to pay him tens of millions of dollars began to lose interest with the cold efficiency that Hollywood has always reserved for performers whose era they believe to be over. From 1985 through the early 1990s, John Travolta existed in a kind of professional purgatory. He made films, but they were the kinds of films that go straight to video or that nobody remembers. He appeared on television. He gave interviews in which he seemed cheerful and unbothered, but insiders who knew him in this period have described a man who was quietly wrestling with an identity that had been defined almost entirely by external success, and who is now being asked, by circumstance if not by choice, to discover who he was without it. It is a question that breaks many people. It is a question that some of the most gifted performers in history have never been able to answer. And it is during this wilderness period that John Travolta made two decisions that would define the rest of his life in ways that no one fully understood at the time. The first decision was his deepening embrace of Scientology. John had been introduced to the Church of Scientology in 1975 by actress Joan Prather on the set of the film The Devil's Reign. He was 21 years old, searching, ambitious, and hungry for a framework that could help him make sense of the enormous pressures he was beginning to feel. Scientology offered him that framework. Over the years, his involvement deepened significantly. He has spoken publicly on many occasions about the ways in which Scientology's teachings, tools, and community supported him during difficult periods. He has credited the church with helping him navigate grief, professional pressure, and personal confusion. And while the public narrative around Scientology, particularly following documentaries like Going Clear and the writings of former members, has become increasingly controversial and dark, John Travolta has maintained a steadfast loyalty to the institution that, he believes, helped save his life on multiple occasions. What's significant about this loyalty is not whether you personally agree with Scientology's practices or beliefs. What's significant is what it tells you about John Travolta himself. Because a man who clings to a belief system through public ridicule, through massive cultural scrutiny, through the death of his children, through the death of his wife, through every personal catastrophe imaginable, that man is not simply a follower. He is a man who has made peace with something that the rest of the world hasn't been shown, and who has decided that the judgment of strangers matters less than the anchor he has found. The second decision John Travolta made during his wilderness years was to say yes to Pulp Fiction. And that single yes changed everything. It is one of cinema's most remarkable comeback stories. Director Quentin Tarantino, who was preparing his second film after the indie sensation Reservoir Dogs, had a specific vision for the role of Vincent Vega, a philosophical, heroin-addicted hitman who dances with his boss's wife, accidentally kills a man in a car, and delivers some of the most memorably strange dialogue ever written for a Hollywood film. Tarantino wanted John Travolta, not despite the fact that his career had been quiet for a decade, but partly because of it. There was something about the weathered quality, the experience, the depth of a man who had been through the fire and come back, that Tarantino believed would make Vincent Vega extraordinary. He was right. When Pulp Fiction was released in 1994, audiences and critics reacted with the kind of electric disbelief that is reserved for miracles. John Travolta didn't just return. He returned transformed, more nuanced, more complex, more genuinely interesting as an actor than he had been even at the height of his 1970s stardom. He received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. He was back. And this time, the Hollywood he returned to was a different place, and he was a different man. The years following Pulp Fiction brought a string of massive commercial successes: Get Shorty, Broken Arrow, Phenomenon, Michael, Face Slash Off with Nicolas Cage, Primary Colors, A Civil Action. He was collecting $20 million per film at his peak. He was one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. He had his own Boeing 707, which he piloted himself, because John Travolta is also a certified pilot, a fact that tends to surprise people but really shouldn't, because it is entirely in keeping with a man who has never been satisfied with doing things halfway. He was flying high professionally and literally. And it was during this second golden era of his career that the other great love of his life moved from the periphery to the absolute center. Kelly Preston. Born Kelly Kamala Lehua Smith on October 13, 1962, in Honolulu, Hawaii. She was an actress of considerable talent and extraordinary beauty, and when she and John first began their relationship in the late 1980s, they had actually met briefly years earlier, in 1978. There was a quality to their connection that people who witnessed it described as something quietly inevitable. Like two people who had been pointed toward each other from the very beginning and had simply taken a scenic route to arrive. They married in September 1991 in two ceremonies, the first a surprise celebration, the second a formal ceremony in Paris when the original plans became too chaotic. It was the kind of love story that, in a town built on manufactured romance, somehow felt completely real. Kelly was not someone who existed in John's shadow. She was fiercely her own person, funny, deeply intelligent, spiritually curious, passionately committed to her family, and possessed of a quiet resilience that those closest to her have described as almost supernatural in its depth. Together, John and Kelly built a life that, from the outside, looked like the kind of life that Hollywood dreamed about but rarely achieved. They had 3 children. Their first, Jett, was born April 13, 1992. Their daughter Ella Blue was born April 3, 2000. And their youngest, Benjamin, arrived on November 23, 2010. They traveled the world in their private plane. They had homes in Ocala, Florida, Los Angeles, Maine. They threw parties that people talked about for years. They were, by every available measure, one of Hollywood's genuinely happy couples. And yet, beneath the happiness, beneath the warmth and the laughter and the perfectly captured Instagram moments, there were things John and Kelly carried privately that most of the world never fully understood. Jett Travolta was born with health challenges that would define, and ultimately cut short, his life. From the time he was very young, Jett experienced developmental difficulties and seizure activity. John and Kelly publicly attributed his condition to a very early illness, Kawasaki disease, which they said he contracted when he was 2 years old from exposure to pesticides and cleaning solutions. They also stated that Jett had autism, a disclosure they made after his death that revealed the depth of the private battle they had been fighting for 16 years. The question of Jett's medical care became intertwined, in the public consciousness, with the Travolta Scientology beliefs, since the Church of Scientology has historically been critical of conventional psychiatry and certain medications. Former members and critics of the church have suggested that this may have influenced the medical decisions made on Jett's behalf. John and Kelly have consistently rejected these suggestions and have maintained that they pursued every appropriate medical option for their son. What is not in dispute is this: they loved Jett absolutely and completely. Every account from people who knew the family describes a household in which Jett was cherished, protected, celebrated, and never made to feel like anything other than exactly who he was. On January 2, 2009, the Travolta family was vacationing in the Bahamas. It was a holiday trip, the kind of family escape that wealthy parents plan to give their children a break from the relentlessness of public life. Jett was 16 years old. During the early hours of that morning, while staying at their vacation home, Jett suffered a seizure. He fell and struck his head on a bathtub. By the time help arrived, the situation was beyond recovery. Jett Travolta was pronounced dead at the Rand Memorial Hospital in Freeport, Grand Bahama. He was 16 years old. John Travolta has described the moment he learned his son was gone as the worst thing that has ever happened to him. And when you look at everything John Travolta has survived, the career destructions, the personal rumors, the professional humiliations, the constant scrutiny, and he says that losing Jett was the worst, you believe him completely. Because there is no grief that compares to it. There is no loss more fundamental. A parent is not supposed to bury their child. The universe has the order wrong when that happens, and a part of you that was pointed toward the future just stops. What made the aftermath of Jett's death even more painful was that it did not remain private. Within days, a Bahamian paramedic named Torino Lightborn attempted to extort the Travolta family, demanding over $25 million in exchange for not releasing a document related to Jett's death. John Travolta, still in the rawness of grief so fresh it must have felt like an open wound, was forced to navigate a criminal extortion case at the same time he was trying to survive the death of his son. He testified in court. He sat in a Bahamian courtroom and told the truth about what had happened, about his son's history of seizures, about the night everything changed, with a quiet dignity that observers present in that courtroom said was one of the most profoundly moving things they had ever witnessed. Lightborn was eventually convicted, but the case forced John Travolta to grieve publicly in court under oath, and if that experience did not change a man permanently, nothing would. John and Kelly leaned into each other after Jett's death with the kind of ferocity that grief sometimes produces in people who are strong enough to survive it together. They also, and this is worth noting, leaned into Scientology in a way that drew both admiration and criticism depending on who was watching. John has said multiple times that the church was an enormous source of support and comfort in the aftermath of Jett's passing. He has spoken about the specific Scientology practices and teachings that helped him move through a grief that might otherwise have consumed him entirely. What is undeniable is that John and Kelly emerged from the loss of their son with their marriage not only intact but, by many accounts, deepened. The loss had not broken them. It had fused them together in a new way. In 2010, they welcomed their third child, Benjamin, and named him partly as an act of hope, of deliberate, courageous hope, in the face of the worst thing they had ever survived. Benjamin's birth was a declaration. It said, "We're still here. Life is still worth bringing into the world. We are not defeated." And then Kelly got sick. In 2018, Kelly Preston received a diagnosis of breast cancer. She did not immediately tell the public. She and John made the decision to keep the diagnosis private, to protect their children, to protect their ability to fight without the weight of a million watching eyes. She underwent 2 years of treatment, chemotherapy, the whole crushing arsenal that modern medicine deploys against a disease it still hasn't fully learned to beat. Through it all, she maintained the kind of grace and warmth that everyone who knew her has described as simply characteristic of who she was. She never stopped being Kelly. She continued to be present for her children. She continued to love John in the way that she had loved him for 3 decades. And John sat beside her through every treatment, every difficult day, every quiet moment when the fear must have been enormous. He has spoken about this period in terms that reveal a man who understood, even while living through it, that he was being asked to give everything he had for the person who mattered most. Kelly Preston died on July 12, 2020. She was 57 years old. John announced her passing on Instagram with a message that read, "It is with a very heavy heart that I inform you that my beautiful wife Kelly has lost her 2-year battle with breast cancer. She fought a courageous fight with the love and support of so many. My family and I will forever be grateful to her doctors and nurses at MD Anderson Cancer Center, all the medical centers that have helped, as well as her many friends and fans who have been by her side. Kelly's love and life will always be remembered. I will be taking some time to be there for my children who have lost their mother, so forgive me in advance if you don't hear from us for a while. But please know that I will feel your outpouring of love in the weeks and months ahead as we heal. All my love, JT." There is no performance in those words. That is a man writing in the honest, jagged language of real loss. That is a man who has been here before, who stood in this exact place of devastation before with Diana Hyland and with Jett, and who somehow has to find the way to stand up again. And here is where we must talk about the thing that has followed John Travolta for his entire adult life, the thing that sits in the corner of every conversation about him, the question that never quite goes away, the rumor that the tabloids have never been willing to fully release. The question of his sexuality. It would be dishonest to make a video about John Travolta's real life without addressing it, because it has been part of the public narrative around him for so long that to ignore it would be to tell only the comfortable version of his story. Over the decades, Multiple men have alleged sexual relationships with John Travolta. The most prominent of these claims came from a man named Douglas Gotterba, who worked as John's pilot in the 1980s and who has claimed the two were involved in a long-term sexual relationship. There were also massage therapist allegations filed in 2012, which were eventually dismissed. John Travolta has denied all of these claims. He has called them motivated by financial gain. He has never publicly identified as anything other than heterosexual. He has never offered what most people would call a definitive statement about his private orientation, beyond those denials. In a 2014 interview with the Daily Beast, when asked about the persistent gay rumors, he acknowledged them almost wearily, saying essentially that people would always find sex interesting and that he was long past being disturbed by it. But he never fully addressed the underlying question. He sidestepped it with the practiced ease of a man who has been sidestepping it for 30 years. And here is where perspective matters. The world in which John Travolta became famous was not the world we live in today. In 1977 and 1978, being openly gay, if indeed that were the truth of his experience, was a career-ending revelation. Hollywood managed gay actors with a sophisticated and ruthless efficiency. You were either fully in the closet, or you were not in Hollywood. Many of the greatest actors of the 20th century navigated this reality in ways that we now look back on with a mixture of sadness and understanding. The pressure to conform, to perform heterosexuality, to marry in ways that served the studio system and the public appetite. It was real, and it was enormous, and it left marks on people that didn't always show in the ways you expected. None of this constitutes proof of anything about John Travolta's inner truth. But it constitutes context. It constitutes the environment in which whatever truth exists was either expressed or suppressed or transformed into something else entirely. And it speaks to the broader question at the heart of this video. What does a person carry in silence for 50 years? What does it do to them? And what does it mean when, at 70, they finally begin to let it surface? What we know for certain is this. At 70, John Travolta has stopped performing in the way that the earlier decades required. He has become more open about his grief. He has become more vocal about what matters to him. He has spoken about Kelly with a tenderness that doesn't feel rehearsed. He has spoken about Jett in ways that reveal a father who has never stopped carrying that loss, who has never fully processed it, who may never fully process it, and who has made a kind of peace with the fact that some grief doesn't get processed. It just becomes part of the architecture of who you are. He has spoken about the uncertainty of life in ways that suggest a man who has been broken and reassembled enough times to no longer be afraid of either the breaking or the rebuilding. He posted a tribute to Kelly on what would have been their 30th wedding anniversary. He posts photos of Ella and Benjamin, his surviving children, with a frequency and openness that suggests a man who has learned the hard way that time is not guaranteed and that love should be expressed loudly and often. He has spoken about his faith. Not defensively, not as a shield against criticism, but as something genuinely private and sustaining. He has talked about the plane crash that never happened, about the thousands of hours he has spent in the sky, about the way that flying taught him a kind of freedom from earthly anxiety that he has never found anywhere else. He has talked about music. He is a deeply musical person, trained as a singer, still performing and recording. He has talked about what it means to age in Hollywood, to watch the machine that once adored you grow cold, to learn that your value is not your box office return, and that the question of who you are cannot be answered by how many people pay to see you on screen. The most powerful thing that John Travolta has revealed at 70 is not a single secret. It is not a confession. It is not a declaration. It is something quieter and more profound than any of those things. What he has revealed is that a life can be simultaneously everything it appeared to be and nothing at all like what it appeared to be. That the man who danced on top of the world carried grief in his bones from his first year of fame. That the man who played the role of Hollywood's most confident, most magnetic performer was privately terrified much of the time. That the man whose family looked like the ideal was actually a man desperately trying to hold together something precious against forces that seemed determined to take it apart. That the man who smiled for every camera was also the man who sat in the dark after his son died and wondered how he was supposed to keep going. And that the man who is now 70 years old, standing on the other side of more loss than most people will ever face, has discovered something that the young man from Englewood, New Jersey, could never have imagined. That survival itself is an act of tremendous grace. That showing up again, and again, and again, after every career death, after every personal tragedy, after every rumor and scandal and professional humiliation, is not ordinary.
It is extraordinary.
And it is, finally, the truth that John Travolta has been revealing all along, one day at a time, without ever needing to announce it. He is still here. He is still flying his own plane. He is still raising his 2 children alone in the big, quiet house where Kelly's presence is everywhere and nowhere. He is still making films, even when those films are not what they once were. He is still performing, still dancing, still showing up to events and giving his smile to rooms full of people who remember him as Tony Manero, as Danny Zuko, as Vincent Vega. He is still John Travolta, which means he is still the most resilient, most persistently alive, most privately complicated, most publicly adored, and most genuinely human of Hollywood's great survivors. And at 70, the mask is not fully off. Perhaps it never will be, completely. Perhaps there are things John Travolta will take with him when he finally leaves this world that none of us will ever know. But the walls are lower now. The performance is quieter. The need to be the version of himself that the world demands has loosened its grip, and what is visible beneath it is something far more interesting, far more moving, and far more worthy of our attention than any character he has ever played on screen. What we all suspected, and what he has finally, slowly, gracefully confirmed, is that the real John Travolta is not a star. He is not a celebrity. He is not an icon or a brand or a comeback story or a scandal. He is a man. A man who loved people deeply and lost them. A man who succeeded beyond imagination and then failed beyond imagination and then got up and tried again. A man who chose faith when the world told him to choose reason, and chose love when the world told him to choose performance, and chose his children when the world told him to choose his career. A man who has carried more weight than anyone watching his films would have ever guessed, and who has done it without complaint, without self-pity, and without ever, not once, not even in the darkest moments, fully giving up. That is what he has revealed at 70. Not a secret, a truth. And it is, in the end, the only story worth telling. The lights in Hollywood have a way of casting shadows that are longer and stranger than the things that cast them. John Travolta has lived in those shadows his entire adult life. He knows their every contour. He knows where they grow cold, and where they offer something that looks almost like warmth. And now, with 7 decades behind him and whatever time remains still ahead of him, he is doing something that the young boy from New Jersey who ran toward those lights could never have imagined doing. He is standing perfectly still, letting the shadows fall where they may, and choosing, finally, to be exactly who he is. Whatever that is, whoever that is, it is enough. It is more than enough. It is, as it turns out, everything. Because here's the thing about John Travolta that no biography, no documentary, no scandal sheet, no tabloid headline has ever fully captured. He is a man who keeps choosing life. Over and over again, in the face of every reason not to. After Diana Hyland, he chose life. After the professional desert of the 1980s, he chose life. After Jett, he chose life. He and Kelly both chose it together emphatically by bringing Benjamin into the world just 18 months after their firstborn son was taken from them. After Kelly, alone this time, in a house full of her absence, with 2 children watching to see if their father would survive, he chose life again. There is no secret more important than that one. There is no reveal more stunning, more unexpected in a culture that is addicted to catastrophe than the reveal that a man who had every reason to be destroyed is not destroyed. That he is, in fact, still here, still moving, still loving, still showing up. Still John Travolta. Still dancing, even when no one is watching. Even when the dance floor is empty. Even when the music has long since stopped. And perhaps that is the most John Travolta thing of all, the truest, most distilled version of everything he has always been. A man who dances alone in empty rooms because the dance itself is the point, not the audience, not the applause, not the role or the record or the comeback or the award. The dance itself, the pure, stubborn, joyful, heartbroken act of moving through this life, as if it is worth moving through. As if every step matters. As if the floor beneath him, no matter how many times it has given way, is still worth trusting with his full weight. That is John Travolta at 70. That is what he has finally revealed. And if you were watching carefully, if you have ever watched him carefully, you realize it was never really hidden at all. It was always there, right in front of us, in every single thing he ever did. We just needed him to get old enough to let us see it clearly. And now, finally, we can.